Mobility is a pretty decisively hated topic in League. The general consensus is that Riot power crept mobility by adding too much over the years, and that we need to get back to the good old days when there wasn't nearly as much. But while this is technically true, fixing the issue is a bit more complicated than just doing a flat reduction of mobility. This is because there are two main issues, being a lack of understanding around the dynamic of mobility, which was then degraded and not properly enforced, and then the power creep of mobility through CDR and the duct tape issue. For the first, I understand how it might sound. Is this guy really saying he knows more than the people who literally made the game? And the answer is yeah, in this case, it's possible. This is because for anyone that knows League's history and how the game was developed, they know it's a miracle that the game even launched, let alone became popular. For example, after a full year's work on the game, 4 of the 5 people developing it straight up just quit, or how they almost went bankrupt multiple times that caused them to release the game early and severely unfinished, or how their lead champion designer was an intern they hired to playtest their game, but since there wasn't even a game to playtest most of the time, they just gave him the job of making champions. The game was not only extremely scuffed, but most of the people developing it didn't even know what they were doing, essentially just copying what they could from Dota, and then jury-rigging the rest based on a bit of experience old community members had from working on Dota. The quote of, "we were flying the plane while building it," is pretty much the best summation I can give of how genuinely awful the game's development was, and it's why I think it's reasonable as to why issues like ability power, mobility, and champion design could be largely unknown to them. This is why we need to work with Riot on these issues instead of against them, giving real suggestions that aren't layered with toxicity and misunderstandings, because all of us want the same thing here, which is to make League the best it can be. But either way, I feel like I needed to clarify because I know a lot of people would have said that and then gone into the video with a closed mind, so now let's get into it. The first issue is the breaking of the dynamic of mobility, which refers to the dynamic between what I will call full mobility, being things like dashes, leaps, and blinks, and partial mobility, which I will just continue to call movement speed because it's easier to follow. Movement speed has its strength and its consistency, meaning it's good for getting around the map much quicker and running enemies down over the long term, but its downside is that it doesn't really have much immediate power. Full mobility, on the other hand, is essentially the opposite, with its strength and its immediacy and short-term power that makes it much better for combat, but with the downside that it's typically limited by things like mana costs, cooldowns, and other limiters like being point and click. This means that movement speed's power is much more gradual and is great for putting on classes of champions that already have very strong combat attributes like Juggernauts and Marksmen, while champions like Assassins and Divers can have the more immediate burst-like strength that full mobility provides at the expense of its consistency. And this is where the problem comes in, where full mobility was power crept through the degradation of mana, the power creep of CDR, and the aforementioned champion design situation, with champions like Riven who have no mana, free cast mobility, and the ability to go over walls, meaning that full mobility was not only stronger in the short term, but also lost its primary limiters that made it balanced and was then now able to be good in the long term, where movement speed was supposed to be the best. And you might think, then why not just buff movement speed to match mobility? And the answer is, yeah, it could work, but due to the fundamentals of the game, notably base movement speed, map spacing, and damage, it would only work if the dynamic between damage and mobility was fixed. Essentially, to explain a fairly complicated topic as quickly as possible, each champion takes a few seconds to walk to the safety of their turret from mid, which is based on how far they have to walk and how quickly they move. This means that a champion being able to blink on top of you immediately gives them that amount of time to deal damage before the enemy is able to get to safety. This then gets us to an option. Either mobility can be high, with damage being fairly low so that you can't just immediately kill them, or damage can be high and mobility be fairly low. And this is why us buffing movement speed without reducing either damage or full mobility only brings movement speed up to being unfun as well. It honestly doesn't really matter which it is, as it's primarily based on preference, but I do think mobility is a very fun mechanic that makes combat a lot more interesting and skill expressive when done right, which is why I personally would rather see damage reduced and mobility kept fairly high. And then for the topic of the degradation of limiters like mana, cooldowns, and baked-in champion design, I think the first two are pretty self-explanatory and go hand in hand. More cooldown reduction means you can spam your abilities more often, and the degradation of mana means you don't need to manage your resources and can use them as soon as they're up. And of course, I'm making this very simple, and I know it's more nuanced than this, but this is typically how it goes for most champions. And then for the last point about champion design, this is referring to the introduction of more and more champions who purposely don't have limits, which was primarily done on purpose to emphasize that power fantasy gameplay that Riot started to go for, but had the unintended side effect of screwing over mobility. To explain, let's look at the dynamic between point and clicks and non-targeted abilities, which is very similar to the movement speed and full mobility dynamic I just went over. Point and clicks have their strength in the fact that they typically can't miss or be dodged, but have the downside of needing to be able to click on a unit to work, which makes them much more predictable and less versatile. Non-targeted abilities, on the other hand, typically have their strength in their ability to hit enemies who aren't in vision, and their ability to be used without needing a unit, which makes them very versatile, but have the downside of being dodgeable and or missable. This means that non-targeted abilities are typically a lot stronger, especially when you consider League's identity of wanting to remain relatively low skill, with more emphasis on macro, so that most skill shots are primarily based on the user missing rather than the enemy dodging. And this is the core of why free cast mobility is such an issue, because they aren't limited in the same way that a point and click is. For example, Old Akali versus the new one. Old Akaliar had more range and more overall mobility, but had the notable limitation of being point and click, meaning if she was pushed up and caught out of position, it was a lot easier to punish her because her mobility was limited. New Akali with her E and R don't have this, however, and can get over walls and escape being caught out much easier due to its lack of limitations. Some good general limitations that can be added to non-targeted mobility are an inability to go over terrain, less overall range, speed, or size, higher cooldowns between uses, and considerable mana cost. But of course, just like the counterplay I went over in a previous video, it could just be specifically tailored for each individual ability to limit its power in a more interesting way that could provide skill expression. Whatever it may be, as long as it does its job at making full mobility not as consistent as movement speed to maintain that balance. This point is why I said Riot most likely didn't know about these nuances of mobility, because Riven came out before Season 2, Kassadin was the 29th champion ever released, and Tryndamere was the 21st. Yeah, there were more point-and-click champions that accidentally ended up slotting into this type of limitation most of the time, but we have a pretty good idea that it wasn't really a planned thing by Riot, and it was primarily just due to a lack of experience when it came to champion design. And when you consider things like Riven being extremely popular, it might have even given Riot the idea that people liked free cast mobility, not understanding that Riven was literally just head and shoulders above almost every other champion, and people primarily just enjoyed winning. And this lack of understanding was further shown in how they duct taped older champions to fit the power crypt mobility, with champions like Udyr and Mundo gaining CC immunity, Volibear and Rammus gaining leaps, Nasus Wither being buffed so much, and it's most likely why we'll see something similar with Skarner during his rework, because he also falls into that power creep issue and is barely played largely because of it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Mobility was power crept by the influx of CDR and its limitations being degraded more and more over the years, until it overstepped into movement speed's territory, not only breaking the balance between base movement speed, damage, and map spacing, but also movement speed's combat power of its consistency over time. And because of this loss of balance between movement speed and full mobility, by either not understanding or maybe just a difference in opinion, Riot began to add more counterbalances to champions who were affected most, with problematic additions like dashes onto champions that shouldn't have them, which exacerbated the mobility power creep issue and got us to a fairly toxic state of mobility that the game exists in today.